Hi and welcome back everybody. Since my first video about reducing bubbles in non-pressure pot dice casting, I've had a ton of questions about where I got my molds from. Spoiler, I make my own molds, and yes, I do it without a pressure pot, and you can too. So let's go ahead and jump in and talk about how to get the molds you want without a pressure pot. The absolute most important consideration when you're making a mold without a pressure pot is your choice of silicone. You need one that is going to be low enough viscosity to penetrate all the cracks and crevices of your masters and release bubbles. You're also going to need something fairly slow setting. Around an hour of work time is ideal, which allows a slower pour and optimal bubble release. Unfortunately for us, this eliminates a whole lot of the most popular mold making silicones out there, like Sorta Clear and Dragon Skin, because they are too thick and heavy bodied and they cure too quickly. So far, I've only tried silicone from Let's Resin, and I have made 5 different iterations of molds using it successfully. If you have any thoughts on silicones I should try, feel free to drop it in the chat, and maybe I'll get around to doing a review video for those silicones like I did for resins. What I have really liked about the Let's Resin is, one, its low viscosity, as I just showed you. It's great at releasing bubbles on its own, and it has no strong odor. I can also measure it by weight, which I always prefer to volume because I think it's more precise when you're working with viscous liquids. It's also just a tiny bit translucent, so I can kind of see a bit of what's going on inside my molds as I cast. Another important consideration to any dice mold making is your masters. My first molds were made out of an old Chessex set, which means they were copyrighted designs and not sellable, but just fine for personal enjoyment and learning. Also, I didn't have to worry about mold inhibition because they were quite old. For those maybe not familiar with that term, mold inhibition is when your silicone doesn't cure fully around your master due to interference from the sulfur compounds that can be residual in some 3D printing resins. The sulfur compounds interact with the platinum in platinum cure silicones, which are the most commercially available 1:1 ratio silicones. You have 4 options to avoid this inhibition. Number 1, buy masters made of a material that doesn't contain those compounds. For me, that meant buying these beautiful masters from Arcana Cast. They are made with a compound that does not create that risk of inhibition. However, a word of warning, this can be expensive because the materials to make them are expensive and you have to pay the maker what they're worth. But it is the simplest approach to avoiding inhibition. Second, you can buy an inhibitor like Inhibit X, which will inhibit those sulfur compounds and prevent them from interfering with the silicone. But Inhibit X is hard to come by in some countries and also expensive. Number 3, you can oven cure your masters. Full disclosure, I'm skeptical of this, but Richard Thompson did a great series of experiments and it seemed to work for him. I'll link his video up top. And fourth, you can buy a tin cure silicone rather than platinum cure. They're a little less common and harder to find overall, but they are out there. And again, I've not used any tin cure silicones, but it is a viable option. Aside from your silicone and dice masters, you're going to need a few other materials. First, you need a cup and a mixing stick. In my video on reducing bubbles in castings without a pressure pot, I mentioned using a silicone stir stick like the one on the left. That is not an acceptable tool here unless you want to ruin it. Silicone doesn't stick to much, but it sticks like crazy to other silicone items. I recommend a disposable popsicle stick or something similar for this. I also prefer to work in clear cups so I can monitor the consistency of my mix and watch for bubbles. Number 2, a scale or graduated measuring cup for measuring the components of your silicone. Again, I far prefer to use a scale and do things by weight as I think it is more precise, and I've never had an issue with mixing ratio mistakes when I've used weights. There's our popsicle stick. I like using these for stirring because I can throw them out. Silicone makes a giant mess when you're working with it. Number 3, you need packing tape. You'll want to make sure your tape's adhesive won't inhibit the silicone because some can. I suggest testing a small amount of the silicone on some tape before doing the big pour if you aren't sure. I use scotch packing tape and haven't had any issues. Next up, you're going to need some PVC fittings. These are going to be our actual containers for the mold. I use a 1 inch to 1.5 inch diameter fitting for individual molds and a 4 inch to 4.5 inch for slab molds, like what I'll be making today. These are super cheap at your hardware store, so they are a great tool to keep around. Next up, you're going to need a glue gun. I recommend a high heat hot glue gun because that way any residual heat from the silicone curing isn't going to melt your hot glue. We're going to use this to seal the base of our mold. Since our silicone has to be super thin without a pressure pot, it also leaks like crazy. And believe me, I know this from experience. Finally, we're going to need some small items to use as mold keys. I'll explain more about that later, but in essence, mold keys are what allow your lid to go on correctly each time. I make cabochons out of my leftover silicone, and so I always have those lying around. You can also buy those for super cheap. And I also use tiny, cheap gems, as you can see, and they work great for my smaller keys. Alright, I'm just going to say there are already several great videos that cover the basic techniques of mold making. The core of my technique comes from a video by Dice Witchery, which I'm going to go ahead and link above for you. But there are a couple of changes I've made to make this work better without a pressure pot. So I'm starting off with about 2-inch pieces of tape on my tray, and I am going ahead and taking the lowest side of my dice masters and sticking it down to the tape and making sure using my finger that I have a really good seal all the way around. I don't want any silicone getting under that tape and getting on that face while I'm working. Next up, I'm going to go ahead and mix a very small batch of my silicone. And the reason I'm going to do a small batch is because the largest problem we face without a pressure pot is that air bubbles will get trapped in the numbers of our masters, and this will lead to incomplete numbers being in our final mold. So to prevent this, what I like to do is actually pre-treat the numbers with silicone. I'm going to give you a heads up that it is a tedious process, but well worth it for the results in the end. So once I get my silicone weighed out, and this is really only about 12 grams of silicone, seriously a very small batch, I'm going to mix it up for 5 minutes. The Let's Resin A and B parts don't have any difference in consistency or color or anything, so there's really no way visually to tell when it's fully mixed. So I just set a timer for 5 minutes and make sure that I'm scraping down the sides really well as I go and getting a nice thorough mix. Now I'm going to go ahead and take a toothpick, just a generic toothpick. I'm going to dip it in my silicone, and I'm going to use that toothpick to very carefully fill in the numbers of my dice master. This is not an exact science. There's really no right or wrong way to do it as long as you're not trapping bubbles inside. So I'm going to go ahead and put just a tiny drop on that 7 there and spread it through. If I see any bubbles in the number as I work, I'm going to try to pull them out with the toothpick while it's still nice and liquidy. And we'll go ahead and show you another one. Let's go ahead and fill in the 19. The 19 is a consistent problem in my molds just because of where it's positioned in the mold. I don't really know why. I have some theories, but 19 is always a problem. Spend some extra time on number 19. You want your players to be able to read them. And I'm not being real exact with the silicone on the actual face of the die because it's going to be immersed in silicone anyway. The most important part of this is to make sure your number is completely filled in and bubble free. Aside from that, this is going to be messy. The only reason I'm not wearing gloves here is because this is really delicate work, and frankly I don't have the finger sensitivity with gloves on. And also, I've read the SDS sheets on the Let's Resin silicone, and I didn't see any risks I wasn't willing to take by not having gloves on. I also keep baby wipes by my workstation because it's great for removing silicone and resin from your hands. Alright, it's about 4 hours later. Our coats on our dice are nice and set, as you can see here. So it's time to go ahead and assemble them and get them ready for placing in the final slab mold. Just show you how nicely they are filled up with silicone. Alright, here's my 4-inch PVC fitting, and that's just parchment paper on my tray. I'm going to go ahead and trace a circle around my PVC fittings so that I can kind of dry fit things before I put them inside. It's always easier to work before you get into the PVC fitting, in my opinion. So we're going to take our shipping tape and we're going to tear off strips that are a little bit wider across than what the base of our fitting is. And you want to have some overlap on the outside so it gives you a place to put down the hot glue to seal it when you are getting ready to pour. For me, this took about 3 strips for the 4-inch fitting, and I'm just making sure that there are no bubbles or wrinkles where the strips overlap, because any bubble or wrinkle is going to create a place that the silicone can get out, and we do not want that. I cannot stress enough to you guys how messy silicone is when it leaks. It's even worse than resin, in my opinion. Alright, I have my Exacto knife, and the reason is, if I leave those 2-inch tabs complete on the bottom of my master dice, I'm not going to be able to fit them all nice and snug next to each other, so I need to trim off some of this excess tape. Please be careful while you're doing this. Exacto knives, as I know from personal experience, are incredibly sharp, and you just don't want to have to go to the ER and explain what happened. So, be careful, but do trim off, probably half of the tape, I think is what I ended up needing to do. And again, just like filling in the numbers, this is going to be a little tedious, but very necessary. And almost forgot I was going to do a dry fit, so go ahead and remove my tape raft. And now I'm just going to use that tracing of the PVC fitting, and I'm going to kind of practice place my dice until I get an arrangement that I'm happy with. So go ahead and trim that D20, get it nice and clean, and we're going to go ahead and place it. And I'm literally going to do this for all the dice, and you don't need to watch me do it for all the dice. So we're going to go ahead and speed this along. I do speed up this video quite a bit because you don't need to watch the tedious bits at real time. Just know that you need to take your time when making dice molds, so this looks faster than it is. I'm also using the little bits of tape left on the masters to kind of overlap them. Alright, once I'm happy with the arrangement, I'm checking real quick with the pipe fitting to make sure that it's going to fit. Had a little snag there, that packing tape's so sticky. And I go ahead and put my kind of base tape raft down. And now for the tricky part. We got to pick up those masters that are really only held together with those tiny tape tabs and lay them down very neatly as possible on that base of tape. This was very nerve-wracking and is very nerve-wracking the first time you do it. And the other thing you want to do then is make sure that all of the edges of the tape tabs are pushed down. Anywhere an edge is popped up, you're going to have the risk of your lid not being flush, and we don't want that. Alright, now we're going to grab the fitting. I'm going to carefully center it. I'm sorry about my poor camera skills, y'all. I'm still learning. Be patient, please. And I'm going to go ahead and fit it over top. Now I did forget to record me putting down my keys, but as you can see, the key with keys is to use different shapes and different arrangements all over and throughout. The more different arrangements you have and the more asymmetrical it is, the lower the likelihood that you can put your lid on in the wrong orientation. That is one of the main reasons for keys. And there's really no right or wrong way to do keys. You just kind of gotta use what you have and be flexible. I know some makers who actually use like kids' Legos to make their keys, and they do it pretty successfully. Alright, you can see we've already got the bubbles starting to release in our silicone. This is about 200 grams of silicone in order to fill the mold sufficiently and get a good depth over the ends of the die. For me, that's with the 4-inch fitting, so just for reference, for the 4-inch fitting, I needed about 200 grams of the Let's Resin. Here's my high temp glue sticks, so what I'm doing right now is letting my silicone sit for a minute and let that bubble release really get going. And in the meantime, I'm going to take and seal the bottom of my mold using my high temp hot glue. This is why you need some overlap from the tape around the outside, because that's what our hot glue is going to sit on. So all I'm doing is running a nice thick bead of glue around the bottom. Most often I will do 2 beads, one on top of the other, just to make sure I get a really good seal. I really don't want any of that silicone escaping. And so I'm just going to go around, fill it in, make it pretty. And the beauty of the clear packing tape, as you'll see in just a moment, is that I can flip this mold over and check and visually see that everything is nicely sealed. And I love having the ability to do visual checks. That's just the way I am. So I'm going to set my hot glue gun down, and let's flip that mold over and just take a look. Make sure everything's sealed. Yeah. So we flip, and I can see that my hot glue is sealed all the way around. I can see my faces are really well pushed down for my die. This is kind of the last check before I put in the silicone. And at this point, everything looked good to me. So we're going to clear the workspace, and it's finally time to pour. You can see now as I get close, those bubbles are popping at the surface. That really is the best part of using the Let's Resin, in my opinion. Again, though, as a disclaimer, I've only used Let's Resin silicone. I haven't tried anything else. So if you want to give me some recommendations, I'm always willing to give things a try. Alright, without a pressure pot, it is really important that we pour slowly. Slowly and in a high, thin stream. You want the silicone just to creep through the mold and creep up the sides. And the reason we need to go slowly is actually something you can see with a fun little experiment at home. You can take a detailed object, or your Dice Masters if you have them, and just drop them into a cup or bowl of water. Drop them really quick, and you're going to see that bubbles get caught in all the nooks and crannies because the water closed over it so fast that the air didn't have time to go anywhere. If you take that same object and you lower it into the water very, very slowly, you'll see that the water then fills all the nooks and crannies and there's very few bubbles. The same is true for silicone. We want it to move up the sides of the dice slowly enough that any nooks or crannies in there are going to be filled with silicone, and the air will have plenty of time to escape and get out of the way. That's the best way to get nice crisp molds without a pressure pot. In cases where you have a pressure pot, it is the actual pressure within the pot that is pushing that silicone into those details, but we don't have that benefit without one. So that is why you need to make sure you go nice and slow. Alright, at this point I'm happy with the depth. I've got probably a 1/4 inch to a centimeter of depth above my D20, which is my tallest die. And look at those bubbles popping. It's just a thing of beauty. So now, with the power of movie magic, we'll move forward. And now it's about 6 hours later. My silicone is nice and set. I always finger check it before I go pushing on my mold because it's just that extra safety step. And now, for what I really hate, which is removing the packing tape. This is a pain in the butt, I'm not going to lie. It usually takes me some time and wrestling and frustration. I recommend having your Exacto knife handy or other knife, because if you can just slit the tape, sometimes that's all it needs to really get started. And I am going to speed this along for you. This is at 2 times speed because, frankly, it was making me mad, and I don't think you need to watch me be mad. You are going to see my cat was very interested in what I was doing here, so I apologize for the cat nose popping in and out. Alright, so I'm feeling around, checking for any tape because it's clear. Sometimes you can miss it. And you see on that crystal D4, I think when I dropped the arrangement of dye right before I put it in the mold, I think maybe this face lifted and I just didn't get it sealed down enough. And that's fine. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my Exacto knife and I'm really, really carefully just cutting around the edge. You want to be really careful with this because you don't want to damage your masters and you don't want to scar the silicone any more than you have to. And now you need to remove every single one of those keys you put in. This is why a lot of makers don't use as many keys as I do, because this part is a little tedious. But you do need to get every single one out as cleanly as humanly possible. So you see I'm using the Exacto knife to clean away any silicone that happens to have gone underneath just a little bit while it was setting. So I'm going to go through, clean all these out, use my Exacto knife to its best ability. And right about there is where I realized I had one piece of tape, must have been sticking up when I poured the silicone in. So I've got a big gash over by my traditional D4 shape. Okay. It's time finally to pop out the base of our mold from the PVC. What I like to do is use my fingers and work around the outside of the PVC, just a little pressure at a time, because you don't want to dislodge your masters at this point. You want them to stay in for casting the top. So I work my way around and I pull it out, and oh, I just love this part where you finally get to hold it in your hands. It just feels like such an accomplishment. Okay, so the next stage is thinking about pouring the top. And we're going to pour the top directly onto the bottom. But remember what I said, silicone sticks to silicone. We need to put a barrier down in order to prevent it from sticking and being able to remove the two halves of the mold from each other. So I'm using the cheapest possible brand of petroleum jelly that I could find at the drugstore. And that is a clean makeup applicator. You can also find them sold as mica powder applicators for those who dust their molds. You can also use just a standard cotton swab like what you would use for your ears. I just happen to prefer the makeup applicator. I think it gives a slightly more even coat. You can also, honestly, if you're really stuck, use your fingers, but that is not my favorite. You want to make sure you get around the dice faces really meticulously. Try not to get any on the dice face. If you do, just clean it off with a little bit of a swab and some alcohol. And you also want to get down in each and every one of those keys really, really thoroughly, because that is a spot where the silicone really likes to bond together. Right now, I'm just doing a quick check, making sure I hit every possible surface and making sure that my dice faces are clear. I always do one final check. And about this time, I realized I made a mistake. I didn't cut the keys into the side of my mold. I usually like to do 2 to 3 keys in the side just to, again, help the alignment of the mold. And I gotta tell you, it's a lot easier if you remember to do that before you put the slippery petroleum jelly all over anything. But hey, we live and learn, and in the end, it worked out just fine. So I'm gonna use my Exacto knife, and I'm going to cut really nice, neat keys. I usually just cut kind of rectangle shapes out. And what these are going to form are tabs that come down from the top and really help us seat the mold nice and securely when we're pouring our dice later. So that was 1, 2, and then I'm going to do one more right over, yeah, right here. Let's do it right here. So we'll go ahead and cut. This is where having a nice sharp Exacto blade really helps. And frankly, there's just something really satisfying about cutting silicone. It can be a little addicting. I'm actually planning on recycling one of my old molds later by cutting it into tiny pieces and using it as filler in my new molds. Something I haven't tried yet, but I've heard a lot of makers do it. Alright, now we need to petroleum all around the outside, especially in those little side keys. Again, we need to prevent the silicone from sticking as we pour our top, and the petroleum jelly creates a nice barrier. I'm also applying a very generous layer of petroleum jelly to the entire outside of the slab. And what that's going to do is, it's one, going to make releasing a whole lot easier at the end, but two, it's actually going to create a nice seal when we put the PVC fitting back over this mold, so that we don't need to hot glue and make a big mess again. All we're going to do is slide the fitting right over the top and we'll be good. Alright, just like with the bottom, we have numbers on the top we need to worry about, and we need to prevent bubbles in. Fortunately, unlike the bottom where I needed to paint individually on the top, I can just take a drop of silicone and drip it on one end of the number, and what you'll see it do is the silicone will sink into the number and actually slide in on its own for the most part. So this is much less labor intensive. I have tried doing it this way where I either dunk or just pour the silicone over the masters in the first step, but it's insanely messy and I just didn't get as good results as I did with the toothpick. So I'm going to go ahead and dollop some on every single dice, and I am making sure to hit the end of the number so that the silicone can slide right in and push all the air out as it goes. It's the same principle as why we pour slowly. And this time I'm also not going to wait to pour the silicone on top, because the top is just simpler. There's a lot less places for the air to get caught, and I'm also impatient. So I'm just going to take my toothpick and I'm going to pull out any bubbles I happen to see on the mold faces and just pull them right out. This part, again, I'm sorry, it's tedious, but with molds, it's all about the detail, right? spending 10 extra minutes doing something for your mold is going to save you probably an hour when you're making dice or more, because the less finish work you have to do on your dice, the better. So for me, it's well worth the extra time to make sure that my numbers are really well detailed, that my mold is smooth and fits well. Okay, we're going to go ahead and put our PVC fitting back on. Again, we don't need to hot glue because that petroleum jelly is creating the seal. And we're going to do the exact same thing we did with the bottom. We're going to do a nice slow high pour, and we're just going to let the silicone glide over the dice and into all the keys. We want to make sure our keys are not trapping bubbles this time. And we're just going to pour it along. I'm going to go ahead and speed it up for you because, again, I think at this point you understand how to pour a liquid and I don't need to teach you. So we'll just pour, get it all in there. This is about half the weight of silicone as the bottom was, just so that I have enough weight in my lid to push down on the resin and prevent lifted faces in my final product. All right, it's the next day, and it is finally time to demold our final mold. Yes, that sounds ridiculous. There's probably a better way to say that. So same principle, I'm just going to work around the inside of the PVC fitting with my fingers, and I'm going to pull it out. And now I'm going to just run my finger along and see if there's anywhere the silicone leaked down, any little things that need to be cleaned up. And it felt pretty good. So this is the part where you need to quell your excitement a little bit and go slow. You need to separate the two halves nice and slow and gentle, because if there is any spot that there wasn't really good petroleum jelly down, you're going to have a little bit of silicone attachment. And if you go too fast, you can cause a rip, and that's going to cause all sorts of issues with your mold. So don't spend all that time in the first place just to mess it up now. Go slow. And you can see this came out really nice. I'm so happy with this mold. You can see the die faces are nice and shiny. We've got the numbers nice and crisp. And now it is time to rescue my masters and pull them out. Again, go slow. This is an opportunity where you could rip those numbers you worked so hard to make nice and crisp, and it's just not worth it to rush this bit. So I'm really taking my time. I'm separating the silicone from the sides of my masters, making sure the numbers are released before I start pulling up. The silicone, because it's so flexible, is fairly soft, especially now when it's just finished setting, so you just need to be really careful. And look at those nice crisp numbers. Oh, so happy with that. It's worth every minute of time I put into making it. So that's what I'm going to do for all of my masters. I'm going to work my way around really slowly. I'm going to work them all out. And with movie magic, we're going to speed ahead, remove that nice crystal D4. And I always remove my D20 last. I don't know why. It's just my thing. With the D20, because there's so many crazy angles on it, you need to make extra sure it's completely loose, and then you need to really stretch that mold to let it out, because you don't want those sharp edges digging into the sides of your mold and ruining it before you've even cast dice in it. Checking the fit of my lid, and I'm just really happy with that. And there it is, our beautiful new slab mold that I can't wait to use. Let's go ahead and do some glamour shots of that mold, because man, it's just so pretty. For the record, you can use this technique for individual molds like what you've seen in my other videos as well. It's just that for this particular time period I was making a slab mold, it's a little bit less silicone than doing the individual molds, and so it's just what I was doing. But you can do the same thing just with smaller PVC fittings, and you'll end up with beautiful individual molds too. I really appreciate all the support and love you guys have shown. If you have any extra things you would like me to do, feel free to put it in the comments. Give me suggestions. I'd love to hear them. And happy dicing!